Hey, can everybody hear okay? Okay, good. Try not to do that to you too often. Okay, well, today, of course, we'll have 3 sessions. I think we'll plan on going about 45 minutes each session, and then there'll be a lunch break in between the second and third session today. Do want to just express my appreciation for the really great conversations and discussion we had after the sessions last night. And I was appreciate everybody's attendance, and also really appreciated the questions and the comments, and just the kind of the interaction. It makes it more interesting for everybody, and so myself included. So really appreciate that. So we'll try to do that again today. We'll have a little break between sessions. We'll of course have time that we can discuss at lunch, and then after this afternoon session, just happy to stay as long as anyone's interested in talking. As mentioned last night, one of the things I always really want to make sure is that no one leaves a seminar like this with just a question or something they really wished we talked about that we hadn't talked about, because this is a really good time to do that. And it's not saying we'll have finish the discussion today, but it's good to at least initiate the discussion. And if something comes to your mind next week or sometime, always feel free to send me an email. And there's also some really good information available at the Apologetics Press website. And then we'll be leaving a little bit of material here also for just to be in the library if anyone's interested. And it'll just be up on the chairs here if you want to look after the sessions. Also mentioned last night, the important thing is to keep the goal in mind. This isn't just an esoteric discussion. We're not just trying to win arguments or prove a certain point. Ephesians 4:14-15 tells us, as a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into Him who is the head, even Christ. And so one of the things is, we need to make sure we're not carried about by every wind of doctrine, by trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. And that's applied, or can be applied, in a lot of different ways. But of course today, this whole idea of, well, no, don't believe the Bible. We know from science that the universe and everything in it just made itself. And of course that's completely wrong. It actually goes completely against everything we know about true science. And that's what we'll be covering today. And of course in this first session, we're really just talking about how true science is the Christian's friend and the enemy of the atheist. I'm not sure how else to phrase it. Also, when we're going through something like this, when we're all together and we're just going through points, and the points that we discuss hopefully will seem clear and understandable, and we walk out of here, don't assume that we still can't be deceived, because there's always going to be something coming in from somewhere, or something that that we might hear that is, how do we answer that? And so again, we just need to, if anything, come out of these seminars realizing that the Bible is God's inerrant word. We can completely trust the Bible, and even if we can't think of a response or why something is incorrect that someone mentions to us right away, we have that faith and that confidence, and we look into it. And we go back and we study, and the Bible will always provide the answer. But in general, we can't underestimate Satan's efforts to deceive us. 1 Peter 5:8-9. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. So, is atheism scientific? Answer is no. In fact, the idea that the universe and everything in it simply made itself, it goes against everything we know from true science. True science, again, is the Christian's friend, the enemy of the atheist. God has given us tremendous evidence that we should put our faith in Him, but He also lets it be our choice. Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And I think this verse and others, it actually, to me, it encourages us to study God's creation and to learn more about God's creation. But we do it in the context, in the framework of, again, realizing as God's creation. Where we go astray as a society is when we're studying creation, but we're doing everything we can to deny God and somehow figure out, because creation is really hard to just explain away. You look at just a plant, again, outside in the parking lot, it's vastly more complicated than anything we've ever even imagined. And so to try to explain it, and so to me, that's almost the difference between true science and fake science. fake science is always trying to, at least these days, it's of course this idea that we can explain everything in a manner that, it must have just made itself. It must have just been the result of random processes. And again, it really goes against true science. I'm going to review a couple of slides from last night because I know some of you may not have been here, but also I think they're really important. Again, also keeping the goal in mind, keeping this in context. We're talking about making a choice. We're talking about where are we putting our faith. Keep reemphasizing just the fact that we can choose any choice at all. When you choose what you're going to eat for lunch today, when you choose where you sat this morning, any choice at all means we have to be more than just chemicals. In other words, we cannot just be this sophisticated chemical reaction involving several thousand trillion atoms. We have to have a soul. We have to have a spiritual component, whatever someone wants to call it, because if we did not, we'd have no free will. I mean, literally, we could not make even the simplest decision. And that's important because that's one that's 100%. We talked a lot last night about people that are agnostic, and that's just that's the popular thing to say today. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, people would come right out and say, well, I'm an atheist. But then to me, it almost ties into the whole moral relativism and everything else. That sounded too absolute, so they'll say they're agnostic. Well, again, this is a pretty easy decision. In other words, if you say, well, can I make a choice or can I not make choices? And if someone says, well, I really don't know if I can make choices or not, I mean, they're almost just like playing with it. In other words, they're not taking anything seriously because we all know we can make choices. But for someone to be an agnostic, they literally have to say they're not sure if they can really make a choice or not. I just raised my hand and boy, I'm not sure though, maybe it's just because, where you guys have the thermostat set in the building that made me do that just now. I mean, it's crazy. But that's literally, if someone wants to claim to atheism, they have to say they can't make choices. But if they want to pretend or use the agnosticism just to avoid the subject, just to avoid really talking about things that are important, they literally would have to say, well, I don't know if I can make a choice or not. And at that point, again, they almost need, well, I'll say, if someone really believed that, that's very concerning. Because just think of just how out of touch that is, or that statement would be. So also we talked about just some others. To me, these are just pretty easy things to talk to someone about. This question about, is it scientific to believe that something happens spontaneously, in this case, life arising from non-life, we've been unable to duplicate given our best laboratories, our smartest scientists, and virtually unlimited financial resources. I've asked this question to a lot of people. I've never had a person say it's scientific. Sometimes, though, if they start to go down that path, they're realizing, no, that's just what atheism requires. But there's no way you could say that that's a scientific belief, because it's less scientific than thinking a space shuttle could make itself, or an airplane, or a cell phone. It's because the simplest life is vastly more complicated than anything we've ever made. And so there's some people, of course, really for many decades have been trying to come up with some evidence that maybe life could make itself. And so I'll say a lot of people that believe the Bible, it's so ridiculous that they had just kind of dismissed it. They're like, well, no one's going to believe life made itself. Well, hey, guess what? You go into a museum, you go into a zoo, that's what, they'll usually have a little tiny placard because they want you to move past that really quick. But they'll say, oh yeah, 3.8 billion years ago, life just made itself. And so the good news was, I think it was about 2 years ago, there was a really good book published, just what we know now about what it would take to go from just chemicals to life. And it's and so we brought a copy. It'll be in the library here at the church building, and it's called it's called Stairway to Life. But it's but that was so finally someone pulled that together. And again, just really goes through just all of it basically breaks it down into 12 steps. Each step is completely impossible, and so I guess it becomes impossible to the 12th power. But once you get to impossible, you're pretty much done. And so it's but anyway, so that's so it was good material there, and so. But just briefly, do want to go back and review how we got to where we are now. And this, again, it also is why it can be important to study science, why it is important to study science. Because this was back in 1876. So we're looking at coming up close to 150 years ago. Well, then we didn't know anything at all about life. No scientific knowledge compared to what we have today. So this was a little less than 150 years ago. But this was statements that were made. There was a book published. This was published in a book called History of Creation. It was an individual, Ernst Haeckel, who was trying to, he was very staunch atheist. He was trying to present alternatives to the Bible, alternatives to this belief that, or alternatives to the knowledge that God created everything. And so he wrote this book, History of Creation. And you read these quotes, and it's a book published in 1876. He's, a European scientist. It's in a book. The book had, in the upper left, that's actually a photographic plate from the book. Well, in 1876, if you had a photographic plate in your book, I mean, it had to be true. It was, and so he makes these very eloquent statements. He says, during late years, we have become acquainted with Monera organisms, which are, in fact, not composed of any organs at all, but consist entirely of shapeless, simple, homogeneous matter. The entire body of one of these Monera during life is nothing more than a shapeless, mobile little lump of mucus or slime, consisting of an albuminous combination of carbon. Simpler or more imperfect organisms we cannot possibly conceive. So you see what direction he's going. He's just saying, oh yeah, life just pops up all over the place. It's simple. It's we found this evidence. We know this happens. Completely wrong. But just think of if someone read that, just I'll say eloquently worded, famous individual, renowned scientist, has it in a book. Well, that can be pretty deceiving. And the only reason I mention that is if you read the writings of atheists today, they use the same technique. Everything they say that's verifiable, I guess you'd say, or just every point they try to make scientifically, it's wrong. I mean, they are incorrect, or they'll try to link something that's irrelevant to the discussion. But again, it's the same approach. You just say things in a way you insult people. Oh well, you should do this, or you use I think they call that ad hominem attacks, or you do elephant hurling. Well, everybody believes this, but when you really get down to it, you look at what they're saying, we know it's false. Well, this is the same technique used by Ernst Haeckel. Goes on, it says, the first complete observations on the natural history of Monera were made by me at Nice in 1864. Other very remarkable Monera I examined later, 1866 in Lanzarote, one of the Canary Islands, and in 1867 in the Straits of Gibraltar. The complete history of one of these Monera, the orange-red protomyxa, so now you got a Latin name, so now you really know it's true. And talk about plate 1, and talks about finding them off the Norwegian coast. So again, we didn't know about science, and so in this case, he's using just overall ignorance, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with ignorance. It's a lack of knowledge, but to try to, when taking advantage of it, especially when people try to take advantage of that to lead people away from the Bible, that's when it becomes very serious. And then he talks about the most remarkable narrative was discovered by Huxley, celebrated English zoologist, and so again, just go on and on and on and on. Well, the problem is we knew that Monera were lifeless inorganic compounds. That was as early as 1875. So his book's published in 1876. Already in 1875, someone had said, no, this isn't life. This is just what it was. In this case, it was amorphous gypsum precipitated out of seawater by alcohol. Okay, but even with that clear refutation, Monera, they were taught for about 50 years as evidence that life could just make itself. Okay, and so it's easy in hindsight. We'll have a couple more examples throughout the day. It's very easy. We look back 150 years and it's like, oh, I can't believe anybody actually believed that. How could anybody have fallen for that? But we are exposed to the same types of, I'll say arguments, but the same basic approach today where someone just comes out with these just grandiose statements and they're wrong, but just the eloquent wording, the publicity they get, it's basically against fake science, fake news, whatever you want to call it, it can be deceiving. And so again, when we talk about Satan prowls about like a roaring lion, I mean, this is the case. So we can't, we don't want to get overconfident that even though we look back in history and we say, oh, who could have fallen for that? We're subject to the same type of techniques today. And so again, just one, summary of the book I just talked about. They just shown about the, like formation of building blocks. Even the building blocks of life, they can't form, I guess you say, randomly or spontaneous. This is just, these are all the 12 steps that they indicated would need to be to make life. But you hear every now and then you'll say, oh, there was a organic molecule found on Mars. Like methane, or that's an organic molecule. Ethane, you could call, some people call that a complex organic. So again, it sounds, wow, that's really impressive. It's nothing. It's not even anywhere. It's just kind of like, we have water in our bodies, and we found water someplace, so therefore that means there must be life there. Well, you say, oh, that's ridiculous. But people used to actually say that where there's water, there'll be life. But it's just H2O. Compared to what all would go into life. And then a lot of other ones, Homo Chirality, that's just the physical structure of molecules, matter. Won't go through them in detail here, but it just everything we know, everything we've learned in the last 150 years makes what Ernst Haeckel was claiming it's ridiculous. Now, he also did things like he had fraudulent drawings of embryos, trying to say that the similarities in embryos was somehow proof that, one kind of animal turned into another. We've known they were fraudulent for 100 years. They're still in some of our textbooks, okay? And so that's just one that hasn't gotten removed yet. So again, just be very, I guess, alert and astute in this particular area. Now, when we talk about DNA, it's an extremely complex molecule used to code for all the physical characteristics of all life. Building blocks are called nucleotides. Now, we are getting to the point where we can synthesize DNA molecules, which is really amazing. I mean, that's, again, just, years of research, just the chemistry that we're doing, the type of processes we're using. But, we can also, again, first of all, this is just a very tiny step towards life, but also just, again, this is along the lines of making a space shuttle, in that just because we can make a space shuttle doesn't mean space shuttles make themselves. And so that's very important. But the idea is, okay, so hey, we're getting to where we can make segments of DNA. Maybe we can make them long enough, and then we can splice them together. We can swap. You talk about genetically modified organisms. We're doing stuff like that. Well, but could it really have happened randomly? And so the argument you'll run into is people will say, well, given enough time, anything can happen. And so it's literally, it would be like saying, okay, given enough time, a space shuttle would just make itself. And they try to use different little mathematical tricks. Again, it comes back to where are we putting our faith? What are we going to believe in? But this argument's been around for a long time. This was back 1860. Thomas Huxley, of course, he was one of the individuals quoted by Haeckel. But he said, given 6 monkeys, 6 typewriters, and unlimited time, the monkeys would eventually type all the books in the British Library. Okay, and so again, it's this time thing. Well, we know evolution's impossible. We know life can't make itself. We know this, but hey, we got lots and lots of time. And so the idea is, okay, well, let's go ahead and just see if that's realistic. If that could really happen. And so, say those monkeys are at their typewriters. We'll just give them really simple typewriters. We won't worry about punctuation and lowercase, uppercase, anything like that. We'll just give them 26 letters and see what happens. Well, if it's truly random, that's what he was trying to get at, is the monkeys are just going to be randomly hitting keys on this typewriter. What would be the odds of the monkey hitting a W? Well, there's 26 letters on the typewriter, so 1 in 26 hits a W. Okay, so what are the odds of hitting a W followed by an E? Well, it would be 1 in 26 to hit the W, 1 in 26 to hit the E. So you're 1 in 676, 1 in 26 times 1 in 26. Now you've got to hit 5 keys in a row. So you got 1 in 26 times 1 in 26 times 1 in 26 times 1 in 26 times 1 in 26. Now you're 1 in 11,881,376. So if there's a monkey and he keeps randomly typing "we are," you're like, wow, that's pretty impressive. We are a bunch of monkeys. Okay, now you're 1 in 1.99 times 10 to the 28th. And again, that's basically 1 in a 2 followed by 28 zeros. Okay, so again, we shift to scientific notation. Just want to make that clear when you do the scientific notation. That's not, that is 1 in about 2 followed by 28 zeros to type "we are a bunch of monkeys." We are a bunch of monkeys trying to type something that makes sense. It's not working yet, but maybe given infinite time. 1 in about 7 followed by 135 zeros. Okay, and I've never been to the British Library, but I'm guessing they have books that are more sophisticated than that. And so they use time, but time doesn't help. Evolution doesn't work. Life doesn't make itself. It doesn't matter how old the universe is or how much time, but they use it as a mystique factor. I guess I'll call it that. Anybody ever watch one of the Star Wars movies? Okay, yeah, so how they start out, start out a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And I love that start because you're like, oh good, I'm supposed to just turn the logic side of my brain off and enjoy the movie. I don't have to say, oh, how they do that, or how that, no, just enjoy the movie. And so, but it's that mystique. Well, it's the same thing when people say, oh, 3.8 billion years ago, life just made itself. Well, that 3.8 billion, it adds a mystique, but it does not work. It doesn't matter how much time they claim to have had. It doesn't work. It doesn't matter if the universe is a second old or a billion years old. It doesn't work. And so that's, again, something to keep in mind. And just to give an idea of those numbers, these are numbers we can't comprehend. 20 billion years, it's 6.3 times 10 to the 23rd millionths of a second. Okay, so if you divide that up into millionths of a second, that's about 6 followed by 23 zeros. So that basically means in 20 billion years, you wouldn't get a random "we are a bunch of monkeys" typed. And then number of the atoms in the universe, people agree that's less than 10 to the 80th, which is, again, so those are just to try to put these numbers in scale. But these are numbers we just really can't imagine. We can mathematically write them down, but really can't comprehend the magnitude of those numbers. So just the Miller-Urey experiment, that used to be in biology textbooks. I was actually really pleased. The biology textbook I used in college said, oh, Miller-Urey experiment, that's proof that life can make itself. And it was a huge step forward. And it was back in the 50s, I think, when it was done. Two of the 4 editors of my daughter's biology textbook in college were the same editors. And by that time, they said, well, the Miller-Urey experiment didn't really show anything. Okay, so there is progress, but that's exactly what's true. Because they said they had this very contrived apparatus, and they were trying to make amino acids. And the idea was, well, if we can just make an amino acid or two, that shows life made itself. Which, again, that's the analogy we used last night. That's like saying if I can make a rubber eraser, that proves that space shuttles can make themselves because the space shuttles have rubber in their tires. I mean, it's just nonsensical, but that was basically the approach. And so, but if we look at some of the details that aren't mentioned about all these experiments, long strings of amino acids don't exist in water. That's what one of the things they were calling the water paradox, which you get a lot more details in some of the books we brought. If you look at trying to bond amino acids together in a watery environment, only 1% would have 2 amino acids bonding. If they had like water with a lot of amino acids in it, 0.01% would be 3 to get the smallest protein, about 70 amino acids. That's 1 and 1 followed by 140 zeros. So in a watery environment, you won't even get a long string of amino acids strung together because water breaks the amino acids apart. When we talked about the Homo Chirality, that's kind of when they talk about like one-handed building blocks, and they all have to be a certain either left-handed or right-handed. If it's a protein, you're talking left-handed amino acids. If it's say a DNA or a nucleotide, it's a right-handed nucleotide. This particular experiment, Miller-Urey experiment, produced a small amount of amino acids, 2% of the product. They had to be removed right away to avoid destruction. And you also produced 85% tar, 13% carboxylic acid. Both were, of course, lethal to living organisms. Ongoing controversy over whether the proposed atmosphere could ever existed. We sent a probe into Jupiter's atmosphere back in the 90s, and it essentially found no complex molecules. It found, I think, C2H6 was one of the more complicated molecules it found. So again, before that probe entered the atmosphere, you had a lot of leading atheist evolutionists. I think Carl Sagan was even one of them, saying, "Oh, we're gonna find these just really complex organic molecules, and we might even find life, in the Jovian atmosphere." Nothing. And so again, it's as expected from true science, we found nothing. But again, it was the opposite of what a lot of atheists or evolutionists were claiming. Again, numerous experiments analogous to Miller-Urey have been contrived. They've all failed to show any credible mechanism of protein formation. And then every now and then someone will do a computer program that's basically seeking a predetermined result. And they'll claim that, oh, this is somehow analogous to the original life. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. I mean, I can program a computer to randomly select, type to say we are a bunch of monkeys. Well, if I have the program randomly select letters until it finds a W, then it locks that W in place, and then it randomly selects letters until it finds the E, and then it locks that E in place. Well, yeah, you can do that, but it's absolutely nothing to do with the discussion at hand. But it's, I believe, it's even Richard Dawkins used that, where he would, he'd write these programs that were really irrelevant, but he would claim that somehow that was showing evidence that life could make itself. But again, if talking to somebody, just go back to the fundamentals. Okay, so we're sure this happened randomly. hundreds of billions of dollars in biotechnology, smartest PhDs, best laboratories. Why can't we do it on purpose? If we're positive it happened randomly, just go back to the kind of the fundamentals. This is a quote from Frederick Hoyle. He was a famous British astronomer. He actually coined the term Big Bang. And he ran these numbers, and he also concluded, hey, this can't happen randomly. This is a quote he had. It says, the likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 knots after it. It is enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There is no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor on any other, and if the beginnings of life are not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. Okay, so if you were talking to someone and they said that to you, you'd be thinking, wow, this is great. They want to do a Bible study. They're going to be very receptive. It turned out, unfortunately, with Frederick Hoyle, for whatever reason, I don't think anybody ever found out why, he did not want to put his faith in God. So he knows, being an objective scientist, that evolution can't work. And here he's just talking about life, making itself from an inanimate matter. As a scientist, he knows that's nonsense. And so that's when he did the one with, to a number with 40,000 knots after it. But for whatever reason, he didn't want to believe in God, so he came up with a theory called directed panspermia. Okay? So directed panspermia, big word, sounds technical, must be correct, right? But again, that's kind of the impression people make. All directed panspermia means is he doesn't want to believe in God. He knows evolution doesn't work, so aliens must have put us here. Okay, so if he had said, here's my theory, aliens put us here, well, everybody just kind of chuckles and he gets dismissed. If he calls it directed panspermia, you're like, oh, I got to think about that more. And so you get more of a following. It's kind of like when we were talking last night when they say deterministic free will. Instead of just saying, no, as an atheist, we know you don't have free will, they say, oh, no, you have deterministic free will, which basically means you don't have free will. Okay, so again, it's deceptive. It's like that quote from Ephesians: craftiness, deceitful scheming. And so that's what. Anyway, he wrote 3 books on this. Very smart individual, but basically saying that the way we got here is aliens put us here. Well, what really smart guy? What fundamental question did he not answer? Yeah, who made the aliens? And so he had. The only reason I say very smart guy, it's like he had to have thought about that. And so that's how committed people can be to not acknowledging God. And I don't know how else to phrase it. So when someone says, well, I want to be an atheist, so therefore I must not have free will, I don't know if they really believe that. They're just that committed to being an atheist. In this case, he was so committed to not believing in God that he, again, said that aliens put us here. And of course, the tongue-in-cheek answer would be, well, that's no problem because you must have smarter aliens that made the aliens that put us here. So we're good now. And then, well, who made the smarter aliens? You keep going backwards that way. But it's so again, it goes back to keeping the goal in mind. But we'll say though that leading atheists acknowledge that this is impossible, but they'll still either continue to put their faith in atheism, or they'll come up with almost like another theory that I think they must know doesn't explain the real question, but at least it's a way that they can. Again, always hard to tell what would motivate them, because again, they're eternity. Fred Hoyle's in eternity now. So all he did on trying to lead people away from God or everything, it's he knows the truth now. Another point is where again true science is the Christian's friend. You say true science is the enemy of the atheist. You can also say ignorance is the friend of the atheist, because maybe ignorance is the friend of the atheist is a better way to phrase it, because what's happening is when we don't know much about a subject, the atheists will jump on that and try to spin it in a way that they'll say, okay, that supports atheism. As science advances, it always refutes that. It always has historically, it always will in the future. Genesis 1:24, then God said, let the earth produce living creatures according to their kind, livestock and crawling things, animals of the earth according to their kind, and it was so. Well, that's one explanation for the diversity of life. When God created the original kinds, there's tremendous genetic diversity in those kinds. And so the DNA, and we now know that from true science, of say a single pair of dogs, they could have had DNA that would allow for all the physical characteristics of all the dogs we see on Earth today. In fact, I think most dog breeds have come about just in the last 300 years or so. And that's just people selectively breeding dogs. But they're not creating new genetic information. Whenever we develop a new breed of dog or cat or cow or anything. It's by getting rid of genetic information we don't want. There's never new genetic information created. And so what we see from science is very consistent with Genesis 1:24, with the idea that when God made the original created kinds, within the DNA of those kinds was all of the information needed for all the physical characteristics of all the animals we see on Earth today. And we'll talk about that more. I should mention, we also know from true science now that we could have all descended from a single man and a single woman. And we've probably known this for about 20 years, but it was literally, and the good news is things are happening fast. It was about a month ago when pretty much everybody acknowledged that. And what I mean by everybody, there would be organizations out there that they wouldn't want to come right out and say that they were against the Bible or against Christianity, but they would say things like, "Oh we sort of," or they would say, "Oh we're Christians, but we know from science that there had to be at least 10,000 people. That could never just come from two." Well, they pulled all that off their website about a month ago because of all the evidence that came forward saying, no, we could all easily have descended from a single man and a single woman. And so, again, very consistent with Genesis. And of course, people are created in God's image, spiritual image, which is the key, but even just the physical characteristics of every person we see on Earth today easily could have been in the DNA of Adam and Eve. So the only really alternative to that is if God did not put that information in the genome, it would be that somehow mutations and natural selection, acting on original life form, that somehow created itself. That's how the information came out. Well, it goes against everything we see in the lab, everything we know from science. So maybe another way to think about this is, okay, so true science shows the opposite of evolution is occurring. In other words, information is being lost from the genome, not gained. Okay, and so it's kind of a weird way to phrase it. So I want to just make sure that's clear. Just think of your DNA in plants and animals. That's how God codes. I know a lot of your computer programmers, but that's how God codes for the physical characteristics of life. And so to turn, say, a bacteria into a person, a bacteria is incredibly complicated. Again, more complicated than anything we've ever conceived of. But to turn a bacteria into a person requires tremendous amount of genetic information to be created. And so that's all. I'm really trying, not to, just use a ununderstandable term. That's really the way to look at it. It's just the information in the genome. Where did that come from? Did God put it in the original creation, or did it somehow make itself? And so everything we're seeing, if we look at the genome, is you have information that's being lost, not gained. Natural selection acting on mutations is either information neutral or results in a loss of information. The textbooks examples of evolution, this is one that's really, to me, it's almost amusing, but it's sad. They either show nothing or actually show the opposite of evolution. So when a ninth grader picks up their biology textbook, or I guess now it's probably eighth grader science, or for all I know, it's probably down in third grade by now, and they say, okay, here's an example of evolution. It either shows nothing or the opposite of evolution. And they also use microevolution, which can be a very deceptive term. And so let's give an example. So this was in every textbook pretty much until 2003. I think now they're starting to shift over to Darwin's finches, but it's the same idea. In other words, the same basic approach. And what they'll do is they'll look for changes in life. In this case, or changes in the population distribution of, say, a certain organism. So this is a case of peppered moths. And the way the story goes in the textbooks is, well, in the 1850s, you had those dark gray moths that you see on the right. Those were the Carbonaria form, and they were pretty rare. Almost all the peppered moths were pale, like we see on the left. And the reason was, say they'd live around a city like London, and they'd sit on these trees, I guess like birch trees around the city. And the moth on the left, that was a lot like the coloration of the bark. Out here, of course, you guys have aspens, but it's like birch, aspen, those basic, that type of coloration. So the idea was, well, that moth on the left is going to be really well camouflaged against that tree bark. So a bird's going to be flying along, or a predator, it's not going to be able to see that moth, and so it won't get eaten. But boy, the Carbonaria form, when it's sitting on the bark, that's going to show up. Birds are going to notice to recognize this dark, kind of that, triangular structure, and so they'll get, well, that's what was happening. You had something like 98% were the Typica form, 2% were the Carbonaria form. Well, then the Industrial Revolution happens, and you get a lot of soot on the tree bark. The tree bark turns dark. Okay, so what do you think happened? Well, population density flips. Because that same logic, you can say, well, now tree bark is dark, birds flying along, it can't see that carbonaria form. It just camouflages really well against the tree bark. But that typica form with that little bit of light coloration on it, that's going to stand out. And so the population density flipped. Then you have clean air standards come into play around 1950s, or I don't know if it was clean air, just people decided to clean up the air. Air gets cleaned up, the tree bark goes back to its normal color, population density flips back. Okay, so that's said to be evolution in action. Here's a great example of evolution. And you get the same thing with Darwin's finches and like beak shapes and sizes, depending on what food's available, but it's the same idea. But that has absolutely nothing to do with evolution. Okay, so do you see why? Okay, so I'll just give it one way to think about it is there's no new genetic information created. In other words, the genetic information needed for the carbonaria form and for the typica form, it was always there. And so the population density flipped based on natural selection, but there's no new information, nothing at all to do with evolution. And so that's one where I'd call that a sleight of hand. You'll have a lot of times atheists will hone in on, Christians don't believe in natural selection. It's like, no, 100% believe in natural selection. What we don't believe in, and what science backs us up on, is this idea that mutations in natural selection somehow create tremendous amounts of genetic information, because that's what we've never seen. Okay, so it sounds subtle, and again, now you're starting to, the terms that get thrown around, and again, I call that the ad hominem attacks. Oh, you're a Christian, you don't even believe in natural selection. Well, they're trying to get you to take the bait. What we don't believe in is, because obviously this would work. You have all kinds of examples of natural selection. Has nothing to do with evolution. And so that's the key difference. Go on like bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics. A lot of times we'll read, bacteria are evolving resistance to antibiotics. Well, it turns out they're developing resistance, but from true science, we know that develop the resistance in 3 ways. 2 of them have nothing to do with evolution. One of them is the opposite of evolution. Okay, so 2 of the ways that have nothing to do with evolution. One is, if I get infected by a type of bacteria, and say I take an antibiotic, that antibiotic kills 999 out of 1,000 of those bacteria. Okay, that is a really good antibiotic. It's just getting wiped out 999 out of 1,000 bacteria. But if my immune system doesn't kill that other surviving bacteria, and that surviving bacteria has had a resistance to antibiotic, it's going to recolonize my body. And now when I take that same antibiotic, it doesn't do me any good, because I'm infected with an antibiotic-resistant strain of bacteria. But nothing to do with evolution, because the information to resist the antibiotic was always there. Okay, so there's no new genetic information created, even though an antibiotic-resistant strain developed. There's a process called plasmid transfer, where you can have a real, like say a harmless bacteria, and a lot of bacteria are actually even good for us, but you can have that's resistant to an antibiotic. It can actually, it's essentially exchanging, it's like say small loops of DNA with a bacteria that's in close proximity. It can actually transfer that resistance to another bacteria that might be harmful to us. But again, nothing to do with evolution, because the information to resist the antibiotic was always in the genome. And then another, the third way that's the opposite of evolution is a lot of our, I guess let's call them like designer antibiotics or more advanced antibiotics. Well, they'll essentially, the bacteria views the antibiotic as a nutrient, and it takes that particular nutrient into itself, and then by ingesting effectively that antibiotic, it ends up killing the bacteria. What if the bacteria has an information-losing mutation, opposite of evolution, that makes it so it can no longer take that nutrient in? Okay, it's lost information, but it's no longer taking this nutrient in. In other words, it's no longer able to take in that antibiotic. It survives, but it was surviving because of a loss of genetic information. And that's why a lot of doctors, they try to get people out of the hospital as fast as possible with a bacteria infection. And they'll actually, a lot of them will tell people to get outside, because they know the normal bacteria around us are actually much stronger than what we call superbugs. And that's why you only get superbugs inside of hospitals. And so you see what we have. We have 3 ways bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics. 2 are the opposite of evolution. Or, I'm sorry, 2 are neutral, 1's the opposite of evolution. And so that's why, so a slide ago I mentioned how microevolution is an intentionally deceptive term. And you'll see it, if you guys are having biology textbooks, or you'll see that in those textbooks. The reason it's intentionally deceptive is they'll say that third way, they say, oh, that's microevolution, it's a small change. Or like the classic one is a new breed of dog and cat. And this is actually in some of the teacher's editions. They'll say, tell your students to go down to the pet store, and when they see a new breed of dog or cat, tell them, well, that's microevolution, it's a small change, okay? So, but the problem is a new breed of dog or cat, the way that breed's developed, again, is getting rid of genetic information we don't want. In other words, to develop say you had two original dogs, to develop a small dog, say a Chihuahua, you don't generate genetic information. So say a small dog, you get rid of the information for a large dog. So the way you would develop, say, I'm not picking on Chihuahuas, if anybody, but just you get rid of all the genetic information that is not Chihuahua. And someone had to define what Chihuahua was. But but anyway, you try to get rid of all that genetic information. So it's a loss of information. So new breed of dog and cat, and that's why a lot of purebred dogs, cats, they'll have genetic issues. Because in the process of getting rid of the information that we didn't want in those animals, we actually get rid of some of the information that was also important. And so that's a huge problem. It's another topic of discussion. But that becomes a problem in many many purebreds, but pure situations. I'm thinking of like wheat in Africa. There's things where actually you're causing major problems because we tried to get rid of too much genetic information. We ended up getting rid of the information that we actually wanted. But the whole point is, okay, so if that's microevolution, breeding a new breed of dog or cat, and then what linguistically, if someone says, okay, now we're going to talk about macroevolution, well, what do our brains do? What they want our brains to do is to say, well, hey, I just saw an example of microevolution. And so since I saw an example of microevolution, maybe given this billions of years, then you'd have macroevolution. But it doesn't work that way, because microevolution, you go in the opposite direction. And so try to give analogies. I'll give one. Say this was actually an investment seminar. Okay, and I came in here, and of course my job is to get you to give me all your money. And so what I'm going to say is, okay, I've got this plan. We're all going to get rich. You give me all your money, we're all going to get rich. The way we're going to get rich is we're going to make these little machines, and every time we sell a machine, we're going to lose $1. But don't worry, we're going to make it up in volume. Okay, you're going to give me all your money. I hope you don't. Good. I'm glad you all. But that's actually the more machines we sell, the faster we're going to go bankrupt. Well, that's microevolution. The more we lose genetic information, the faster that species is going to go extinct, or the faster you're going to have information loss, catastrophe, whatever you want to call it. You're not going to turn, microevolution doesn't lead to macroevolution. It leads, eventually it would lead to extinction. But that's a sleight of hand. Again, it's just watching what they're saying. And they're either, I think, and I should say, I think most teachers, I have an incredible respect for teachers. My wife has taught before, she substitute teaches. Because, a lot of times they'll have 120 students, they'll have this much stuff they have to get through, and they've got, they're having to work 16 hours a day. So it's, I don't think it's teachers being deceptive. I think it's frankly a lot of the people that drive what's published in the textbook, the people that drive what the kids are taught. And so, but I think if anyone thought about this, they would know that microevolution is again, I don't know how else to phrase it, it's an intentionally deceptive term, but it's all over the place. And you'll see that a lot. Again, with the implication is, well, we see microevolution now, that must mean over time you could get this macroevolution. We went through this analogy last night. But again, the whole point is just thinking about kind of a common sense analogy. We know that mutations and natural selection aren't going to lead to new information, new functions. So belief in evolution, and we'll have in about 3 slides, fundamental impact an impact on even the most fundamental biblical commands. This is, of course, Luke 10:27. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. That's pretty straightforward. Very few people will disagree with that. But you look at what's happening in the genome, and things like eugenics are starting to come back. This idea that, well, maybe we need to have genetic screening before someone's allowed to have a child. We won't get to go through it today. If you go back and look at what happened in, I think it was about 2018, 2019, where you had Iceland announce that, hey, we've eliminated Down syndrome. And the way it was phrased in the headlines was like, "This is great news." And you start thinking, "Wow, genetically, how did they do that? How did they cure Down syndrome?" Turned out they hadn't. They'd actually screened expecting women, done a genetic screen, and they'd put so much pressure on them that they essentially had pressured all of them into killing their unborn child. But it was presented as good marketing. There's like 8 countries that are doing that now. So, but the reason, to me, is because people are focused on the physical. They're not focused on the spiritual. And this is just an example. And I'll just say this is what we're going to, as Christians, be up against, because the studies are starting to come out. True science is advancing, saying, hey, the genome's not getting better. We're not evolving. We're not going to be these little beings with these giant heads in a million years. You're going the other direction. And so this is a paper as Lynch in 2016. Says a new paper written by a leading population geneticist shows that human genetic degeneration is a very serious problem. He affirms that the human germline mutation rate is roughly 100 new mutations per person per generation, while the somatic mutation rate is roughly 3 new mutations per cell division. Lynch estimates human fitness is declining 1 to 5% per generation, and he adds, most mutations have minor effects, very few have lethal consequences, even fewer are beneficial. But you hone in on that. Okay, so if it becomes accepted in society that fitness is declining 1 to 5% per generation, and different people would have different definitions of fitness. And it's not that it becomes accepted if people keep doing scientific studies and that's what they're concluding. Well, how's society going to respond? And it's all going to depend on if we're focused on the physical or the spiritual. If we're focused on the spiritual, we realize it's I don't want to say it's irrelevant because it affects how we evangelize. It affects how we'll basically how we evangelize, how we talk to people about Christ, how we encourage them to obey the gospel. If we're focused on the spiritual, but if we're focused on the physical, well, you start drifting back the way we were right before World War II. What's starting to happen now, we're just saying, oh, we've got to stop this. We've got to figure out a way to make sure that only the most fit children are born. The super race. And so you start going that direction. It is starting to happen, and that's again just the last few years. And so as Christians, it again, I guess I'd say drives home the importance of evangelizing, but also will give us an opportunity, because when people start to realize this, and it might be 10, 20 years, but when it really starts to sink in, and again, it's going to be from advances in true science, again, maybe that will encourage people to be more open to talking about things that are of eternal importance, talking about things of the spiritual nature, not just the physical nature. Best way to love our neighbors, to encourage them to obey the gospel. And again, just a lot of ways that we can pursue a Bible study with people, but it's always good to just keep in our own minds also Romans 1:16, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. Bible's God's inerrant word. We can trust absolutely everything in the Bible, and we just need to be confident in that and use that in our evangelism. So I think we're going to take about I guess we're down to an 8-minute break. That was my fault. But we'll just take a short break, and then we'll pick up again with the next session. So thank you.